Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that feels familiar but is actually completely unrecognizable. 1950s America. The cars were beautiful, the diners were gleaming, and somewhere behind all of that chrome and optimism was a country doing things so deeply, profoundly weird that you will genuinely question whether any of this happened. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a huge thank you to everyone who suggested this topic. You have no idea how much your comments shape what we cover. This channel runs on your curiosity, and honestly, it keeps getting better because of you. We're also on Spotify now, so if you prefer to drift off with us in your ears, the link is in the description. Okay, dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket up, and get cozy. Let's talk about a decade that told you everything was fine and absolutely nothing was fine. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to live in 1950s America? Did people genuinely eat things called meat aspic? Were housewives actually happy, or were they just very good at smiling? Could you be fired for having the wrong opinion about a movie? Was there really a time when a man in a suit knocked on your door to explain what length your grass was allowed to be? Did entire communities decide, collectively and with great enthusiasm, to build neighborhoods where every single house looked exactly the same? Why did so many foods involve gelatin? Why did so many men own fallout shelters? And what exactly was happening at the local drive-in on a Tuesday night that everyone seemed to know about but nobody talked about? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1953. Your television has 3 channels. Your neighbour is watching you, and someone just told you that cigarettes are good for your digestion. Welcome to the most confidently incorrect decade in American history. Let's talk about where you live. Not where you specifically live, where everyone in 1950s America seemed to end up living, almost as if by some invisible gravitational pull, the suburb. Before the 1950s, most Americans lived either in cities or on farms. Then, practically overnight, a third option appeared. A place that was neither of those things, built on what had recently been a potato field and sold to young veterans as the American dream made concrete. Levittown, New York was the most famous example, a planned community of nearly 17,000 identical houses, each with a small yard, a new refrigerator, and a television aerial pointing hopefully toward the sky. The houses were so uniform that men returning home drunk from the bowling alley regularly walked into the wrong one, and, more disturbingly, sometimes didn't notice for several minutes. This was considered charming. The process that created these places was genuinely extraordinary. Developer William Levitt, who gave Levittown its name, essentially applied the logic of the assembly line to house construction. Instead of building one house at a time from foundation to roof, he broke construction into 27 individual steps and sent teams of specialized workers moving from lot to lot, each team doing only their step and moving on. A house that once took months to build now took days. At peak production, Levitt's teams were completing one new house every 16 minutes. Think about that the next time a contractor tells you your kitchen renovation will take 6 to 8 weeks. The price was right too. Just under $8,000 for a house, which veterans could purchase with no money down using the GI Bill. For young men who had spent years in the Pacific or in Europe and come home wanting nothing more complicated than a yard and a quiet evening, this was not a hard sell. The suburbs filled up with extraordinary speed. Between 1947 and 1953, the American suburban population essentially doubled. Communities that had been farmland were, within 18 months, grocery stores and little league fields and streets, with names like Maple Lane and Elmwood Drive, neither of which had a maple or an elm anywhere in the vicinity. And here is the part they didn't put in the brochure. The sameness was not incidental. It was load-bearing. The suburban ideal depended on conformity, not just aesthetically, but socially. When every house looks the same and every lawn is the same size and every neighbour got here the same way you did, young, recently married, similarly employed, similarly hopeful, the pressure to behave like everyone else is not a rule. It doesn't need to be a rule. It is simply the air you breathe. Homeowners associations, deed restrictions, and neighbourhood covenants governed everything from the colour you could paint your shutters to whether you were permitted to hang laundry outside. Some of these covenants went further, explicitly barring black families from purchasing homes in the development, a fact that shaped the demographics of American suburbs for decades and whose consequences have not remotely resolved themselves. The dream was available, but not to everyone, and the geography of that exclusion was built permanently into the concrete. But driving through it on a summer afternoon, past the kids on bicycles and the sprinklers ticking across newly seeded lawns, it looked like something. It looked like the future. It looked like a place where the 20th century was going to work out fine, and millions of people moved in, arranged their furniture toward the television, planted their roses, and decided that this, all of this, identical and new and quietly buzzing with the sound of everyone trying very hard to be normal, was exactly what they had been fighting for. It's breakfast time, and before you even think about eating, you need to understand something. Your refrigerator is not just a refrigerator. It is a monument. It is a statement. It is approximately the size of a small bathroom, and it is white, and it is gleaming, and your neighbour across the street does not have one this large, and that is the point. In 1950s America, the modern kitchen appliance became one of the clearest signals of middle-class success, and manufacturers knew exactly what they were doing. Refrigerators grew, freezer compartments appeared, colours were introduced, aqua, pink, harvest gold, so that the appliance could coordinate with your curtains and also quietly announce your financial situation to anyone who happened to walk through your kitchen. The pre-war refrigerator, if you had one at all, was a functional object, white, boxy, a single compartment, occasionally supplemented by actual blocks of ice. The post-war model was something else entirely. General Electric and Westinghouse and Frigidaire competed not just on cooling efficiency, but on spectacle. Double doors appeared. Interior lighting became a feature worth advertising. The vegetable crisper, a drawer designed to keep produce fresh, was marketed as a revolutionary domestic technology, with the enthusiasm usually reserved for spacecraft. It was a drawer. It kept your lettuce slightly less sad. Millions of Americans found this thrilling. By 1955, refrigerators had begun to appear in colours. This sounds minor. It was not minor. The introduction of colour appliances represented a philosophical shift in how American manufacturers thought about the kitchen, not as a utility room, but as a showroom, a space where taste and prosperity were displayed as deliberately as a living room. Pink refrigerators existed. They were purchased enthusiastically. Women's magazines ran features on how to coordinate your kitchen colour scheme, which meant that an appliance designed to prevent food from rotting had entered the realm of interior design and was being treated accordingly. Advertisements of the era are remarkable documents. The woman in the refrigerator ad is always smiling at the refrigerator, not at her family, not out the window, at the refrigerator. She's gazing at it with an expression that suggests she has just been reunited with a beloved friend after a long separation. Her kitchen is immaculate, her apron is pressed, and the refrigerator behind her is large enough to chill a small banquet. The implicit message was not subtle. This appliance is your reward. You have earned this. You're a good wife in a good house in a good decade, and here is your refrigerator to prove it. The practical reality was both more and less complicated. The refrigerator genuinely changed how Americans ate. Fresh food could be stored longer. Leftovers became a category. The weekly shopping trip replaced the daily market run that had been standard in cities for generations. Ice cream could be kept at home rather than purchased immediately and consumed before it melted, which led directly to the concept of the home freezer as a secondary appliance, and the concept of the secondary appliance as a marker of additional status, and so on until people were, by the early 1960s, storing entire butchered pigs in basement chest freezers as a demonstration of forward thinking. What nobody mentioned in the advertisements, because why would they, was that the refrigerator also lengthened the list of things a housewife was expected to produce. Fresh food available meant fresh food expected. The convenience, as with most domestic conveniences of the decade, had a way of generating new obligations at approximately the same rate it eliminated old ones. The refrigerator got bigger, the expectations grew to fill it, and the woman in the advertisement kept right on smiling at it, radiant, as if this were the ending she had been promised. Let's talk about what you're going to eat today, because it is going to require a moment of silent preparation. 1950s. American food exists in a category best described as aggressively optimistic, a cuisine shaped by food technology, post-war prosperity, and what can only be described as a complete loss of restraint around gelatin. The centerpiece of the modern housewife's dinner party was often a molded salad, a shimmering tower of lime jello containing, and this is real, suspended shredded carrots, cream cheese, olives, and occasionally canned tuna, set in a ring mould and presented on lettuce with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no doubts about what they were doing. The moulded salad was not a fringe phenomenon. It was mainstream. It was the thing you brought to the church potluck. It was photographed in women's magazines against pastel backgrounds with titles like Your Most Glamorous Summer Salad. Jell-O had been around since the turn of the century, but the post-war period elevated it into an organising principle of entertaining. Gelatin could hold things. This apparently was enough. If it could hold shredded carrots in suspension, it was food. If it could hold cream cheese and olives and a brave little piece of celery, it was cuisine. The line between dessert and dinner side dish was treated as optional, and that was fine. Apparently that was completely fine. But the gelatin was only the beginning. 1950s. American food was broadly shaped by two forces: the food processing industry, which had accelerated enormously during the war and was now enthusiastically deploying its capabilities on the domestic market, and the cultural belief that modern science had improved on nature in essentially every area, including lunch. Canned soup was not just convenient, it was modern. Frozen vegetables were not just quick, they were scientific. The housewife who opened a can of cream of mushroom soup and poured it over a casserole was participating in progress. The casserole itself was possibly the dominant food form of the decade. A casserole required a baking dish, a can of something creamy, a protein of some description, and a topping, usually crushed crackers or fried onions from another can, and an oven set to 350 for 45 minutes. The result was a unified beige mass that could feed 6 people and required no particular skill to execute, which was described in cookbooks with an enthusiasm that has not aged gracefully. Tuna noodle casserole, green bean casserole, chicken and rice casserole. The casserole era produced a generation of Americans who thought of dinner as a single object rather than a collection of components, and who are now, in their 70s, inexplicably nostalgic about it. Then there were the convenience products designed specifically to make cooking require less cooking. Bisquick, Velveeta, Dream Whip, Miracle Whip, which was not mayonnaise but was positioned as an improvement on mayonnaise, a claim that has provoked strong feelings ever since. TV dinners appeared in 1953, a frozen tray compartmentalized into meat, starch and vegetable, designed to be eaten in front of the television on a folding tray table, which was also a product you could purchase. The meal was designed around the furniture. This is the most 1950s thing that has ever happened. None of this was cynical exactly. It was earnest. People genuinely believed that food technology was making life better. That having 12 varieties of canned soup available at the grocery store was a form of abundance worth celebrating. And amid all of it, the gelatin moulds and the frozen trays and the casseroles and the Velveeta, dinner was still a time when the family sat down together, which whatever the food looked like was the actual point. The lime jello with the olives was not the point. It just happened to be on the table. Try not to look at it directly. One evening in the early part of the decade, something changes in the living room. The furniture, which had previously faced the fireplace or each other in a configuration that suggested people might talk to one another, is quietly rearranged to face a large wooden box with a small grey screen. The television has arrived, and American family life will never be entirely the same. By 1955, over half of American homes had a television set, and by the end of the decade it was nearly universal. This was remarkable not just as a technological shift but as a cultural one. Suddenly, every living room in America was receiving the same images, the same advertisements, the same vision of what a family was supposed to look like, which was always white, always suburban, always smiling, and always in possession of a product they hadn't known they needed until 30 seconds ago. The early television schedule was a thing of strange beauty and stranger ambition. Programming ran only part of the day. When there was nothing to broadcast, the station would simply display a test pattern, a geometric target image accompanied by a steady tone, which families would sometimes watch, because there was apparently a transitional moment in human history during which people would sit quietly and observe a stationary circle and find this acceptable. This is a useful reminder that television had to earn its hold on us. It got there very quickly. What it broadcast, once it was broadcasting, was a particular version of American life that had the effect of making real American life feel slightly inadequate by comparison. The television family of the 1950s, embodied by programs like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet, was defined by its tidiness. The houses were clean in a way that real houses were not. The children's conflicts resolved within 22 minutes. The fathers were present and wise and arrived home from work at the same time every evening to a wife who had, for reasons the show never examined, never sat down since breakfast. The families were warm and funny and moderate and optimistic, and watching them from your actual living room, with your actual children arguing about the actual remote control, the gap between that world and this one had a specific emotional texture. Advertising made everything more complicated. The commercial break, which arrived with television and has not left, transformed the domestic interior into a target. Every problem you didn't know you had, odours, inefficiencies, inadequate shine on your floors, the specific beige of your bathroom was identified by an advertisement and immediately provided with a solution. Purchasable at your local grocery store. Women were the primary audience for daytime television advertising, and the advertising understood this with predatory precision. By the end of the decade, the average American household was spending a meaningful portion of its income on products that had not existed 10 years earlier, and that they had been told by a woman in an apron on a screen were essential. And yet there was something genuinely magical about it too, and it would be unfair not to say so. Television brought things into living rooms that had never been there before. The Army McCarthy hearings, broadcast live in 1954, let millions of Americans watch, in real time, as a lawyer named Joseph Welch looked at a senator and asked quietly, "Have you no sense of decency? It changed things." Edward R. Murrow's journalism used the medium with a seriousness that its inventors hadn't planned for. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and was filmed only from the waist up, the decision to censor his hips told you more about the decade's anxieties than any newspaper editorial could. The television did not ruin everything wonderful, but it rearranged where wonderful happened, and it was very good at making you feel quietly, persistently, that what was happening on the screen was slightly more real than what was happening in your room. You wake up at 6:30, but this is not when your day begins. Your day began last night when you soaked the beans and planned the menu and checked that the good tablecloth was clean and laid out your husband's clothes so he wouldn't have to make any decisions before coffee. You are a housewife in 1950s America, and your job, which is not called a job because it isn't paid, begins before consciousness and ends after everyone else is asleep. Magazine articles of the era described homemaking as a fulfilling vocation, a creative profession, a noble calling. What they described less frequently was the actual number of hours. Studies conducted at the time suggested the average housewife worked between 55 and 80 hours per week, a figure that was largely invisible because the work took place inside a building that was also supposed to be a place of leisure. The morning alone was a production. Breakfast was not optional, And it was not cereal poured from a box in 3 minutes. It was eggs, possibly bacon, toast made under a broiler because pop-up toasters were still a luxury, juice squeezed or poured, coffee percolated, children located and dressed and fed and dispatched, husband fed and dispatched, kitchen cleaned behind them like water closing over a stone. By 8:15, everyone was gone, and the house was quiet, and the housewife was already 45 minutes into a workday that had no defined end time. Then the cleaning. The 1950s housewife did not clean on a schedule of her own choosing. She cleaned on a schedule established by decades of women's magazine publishing and the collective social pressure of a neighbourhood in which everyone could see everyone else's curtains. Mondays were laundry. Tuesdays were ironing. Wednesdays were thorough cleaning of the main rooms. Thursdays were marketing, the grocery shopping conducted with a list prepared against a weekly menu, budgeted to the dime. Fridays were for the bathrooms and the floors. Saturdays were whatever had accumulated. Sundays were for church and then the Sunday meal, which was the largest meal of the week and required the most preparation and produced the most dishes. What made this invisible, beyond the obvious fact that it occurred inside a private home, was that its output was an absence. A clean house produced no visible product. A well-fed family was fed and then hungry again by morning. The ironed shirts lasted until Thursday. The work was consumed as fast as it was produced, leaving nothing behind but the expectation that it would happen again tomorrow at the same standard without comment. If you did it well, nobody noticed. If you did it badly, everybody did. And outside the domestic labour, there were the social obligations, the PTA meeting, the church committee, the neighbours who expected to be visited, the appearance carefully maintained of being a woman who had time, who was not frantic, who had not been on her feet since 6:30, who was, when you arrived at her door unannounced, simply and serenely at home. The performance of effortlessness was itself an enormous amount of effort. Betty Friedan called it, in 1963, the problem that has no name, a vague dissatisfaction, a restlessness, a feeling among educated women that the life they had been told was the destination was, in some way, they couldn't quite articulate, not enough. By the time she named it, millions of women recognized it immediately. They had been living it for a decade, ironing shirts at 11 at night, smiling at refrigerators, and wondering, in the quiet hours after everyone was asleep, if this was exactly what they had been promised, or if something had been slightly mistranslated along the way. Let's go outside for a moment, past the rose bushes and the newly mowed lawn, to the slightly strange concrete structure your neighbour just had built next to his vegetable garden. That is a fallout shelter, and in 1953 America, it is not unusual. In fact, the federal government has been strongly encouraging you to build one. There are pamphlets, there are instructional films, there is a whole aesthetic of cheerful preparedness surrounding the idea of nuclear annihilation, as though the correct response to the possibility that the Soviet Union might vaporize your city is to stock a concrete room with canned peaches and a deck of cards and wait it out. The bomb shelter boom was, at its core, a government public relations problem wearing construction overalls. After the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, the American government faced a delicate communication challenge. How do you tell your citizens that the security you promised them after the Second World War has already been compromised without causing the kind of panic that empties grocery stores and destabilizes elections? The answer they arrived at was preparedness. Don't tell people they're in danger. Tell them danger can be managed. Give them something to build. The Federal Civil Defense Administration produced materials of genuinely impressive optimism. A pamphlet called Survival Under Atomic Attack explained, with numbered steps and helpful diagrams, how to protect yourself from a nuclear explosion. Key advice included lying face down, covering exposed skin, and avoiding windows. This was distributed to millions of American households as though it were a reasonable document rather than a polite fiction. It was not a reasonable document. A nuclear weapon detonated within several miles of your location would not be significantly deterred by the fact that you were lying down with your arms over your head, but the pamphlet gave people something to do, and doing something felt better than the alternative, which was acknowledging the complete truth. Home shelters ranged from modest to elaborate. At the simple end, a reinforced basement corner with a 2-week supply of canned goods and a hand-cranked radio. At the other end, fully constructed underground bunkers with bunk beds, ventilation systems, board games, and enough supplies to last 90 days, sold by companies that advertised in the same magazines as refrigerators and washing machines, positioned as a household appliance not unlike the others. One company offered a model it called the Family Refuge Room. It came in 3 sizes. There was a payment plan. The social dynamics of shelter ownership were predictably complicated. Did you invite your neighbours in if the bomb fell? This was debated seriously in magazines and church bulletins as an ethical question. Some argued that a shelter built for 4 could not accommodate 6 without endangering everyone. Others argued that turning neighbours away to die was incompatible with Christian values. The argument was never resolved because the bomb, mercifully, never fell. But the fact that Americans were having this conversation, that would you let your neighbours into your fallout shelter, was a genuine moral dilemma in 1958, tells you something specific about what it felt like to live inside the decade. What it felt like, underneath the cheerful pamphlets and the canned peaches and the payment plans, was a very quiet, very persistent hum of dread that nobody talked about directly. The lawn was mowed, the refrigerator was stocked, the children rode their bicycles, and 12 feet underground behind the vegetable garden, the concrete shelter sat empty and waiting, a monument to the particular 1950s art of believing everything was fine and preparing, just in case, for the possibility that it wasn't. At school today, the teacher stops the lesson. Everyone slides out of their chairs, gets under their desks and covers the backs of their necks with their hands. This is the duck and cover drill, and it happens regularly in American schools throughout the 1950s, designed to prepare children for the event of a nuclear explosion by having them crouch beneath a piece of furniture. The scientific basis for this was, to put it charitably, optimistic. A nuclear weapon capable of levelling a city would not be significantly deterred by a standard-issue school desk. And yet the drills continued, not because anyone in authority genuinely believed the desk would help, but because doing something, anything, felt better than telling 8-year-olds that some problems do not have solutions. The Duck and Cover campaign was introduced in 1951 and was anchored by a civil defence film featuring an animated turtle named Bert. Bert the turtle, upon sensing danger, retreated into his shell. The film then applied this logic to children, suggesting that human beings could achieve a similar protective result by ducking under a desk or against a wall and covering their necks. The film was shown in schools across the country. Children watched Bert the turtle pull into his shell. They practiced the motion. They did not, most of them, ask the obvious question, which was that a turtle's shell is a structural component of its skeleton, and a school desk is a piece of furniture made of wood and mild steel, and would offer comparable protection to a firmly held newspaper. What the drills actually did, whatever they did not do physically, was psychological. They normalised the idea of nuclear threat as a manageable domestic fact, like a fire drill or a first aid class, something with a correct procedure that, if followed, would result in an acceptable outcome. This required a sustained act of collective not thinking that is genuinely impressive in retrospect. Adults knew, or could have known had they pressed the question, that the desk was not going to help. They ran the drills anyway. Children learned the motion until it was automatic. The not thinking became, over time, less a failure of reasoning than a practice skill, a deliberate choice to maintain functional daily life in the shadow of a threat too large to sit with directly. There is something almost poignant about the imagery when you look at photographs of these drills. Rows of children in their school clothes tucked neatly under wooden desks, small heads bowed, hands laced over the backs of their necks. They are doing exactly what they were told. They are perfectly obedient. They are 6 or 8 or 10 years old, and somewhere above them, in the adult world that was supposed to have things under control, a careful calculation was being made about how much truth a child could bear, and how much was better replaced with emotion that could be practiced until it felt like safety. The drills continued through most of the decade and into the 1960s. By the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the threat became briefly and terrifyingly specific, rather than abstractly theoretical, the drill felt suddenly inadequate in a way it had always actually been, but which had previously been easier to overlook. People who were children in the 1950s describe the drills in retrospect with a mixture of absurdist humour and something more complicated, a recognition that the adults in the room were doing the best they could with an impossible situation, which is not the same as saying they were doing the right thing, but is also not entirely different. Bert the Turtle has not aged well, in the sense that the advice was always medically useless. But he was, in his way, a perfect symbol of the decade, bright, simple, cheerful, and crouched very small beneath the weight of something it was better not to look at too directly. Let's lower our voices for this one, because in the early part of the decade, volume is dangerous. The Red Scare, the fear that communist infiltrators have burrowed deep into American institutions, schools, governments, and Hollywood studios, is not background noise in 1950s America. It is the primary frequency on which a significant portion of the country is operating. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Wisconsin Republican with a talent for accusation and an indifference to evidence, has made his name by claiming to possess lists of known communists in the State Department, numbers that change conveniently depending on the day and the audience. The fact that he never actually produced a convincingly prosecuted communist from these lists did not immediately slow the proceedings. McCarthy's actual power rested not in the truth of his accusations, but in the cost of being accused. You did not need to be guilty of anything to have your career destroyed by association with his investigations. You needed only to have signed a petition at the wrong meeting 10 years ago, or to have attended a social event where a now suspect person was also present, or to have a colleague who knew someone. The architecture of suspicion was deliberately loose, which was the point. A narrow definition of disloyalty was manageable and finite. A broad one kept everyone afraid. The entertainment industry was a particular target. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which predated McCarthy but shared his methods, had been investigating Hollywood since the late 1940s, and by the early 50s the blacklist was a functioning institution. Writers, directors, and actors who refused to cooperate with investigators, or who had past associations with left-wing organizations, found themselves unable to work. Some careers ended completely. Some people left the country. Some cooperated and named names and spent the rest of their lives managing what that had cost them. The films being made in the meantime were, not coincidentally, frequently about the danger of hidden enemies and the importance of loyalty to recognized authority. In ordinary American communities, the effect was a subtle but pervasive self-censorship. People became careful about what they said and to whom. Political opinions that had been unremarkable a decade earlier, sympathy for labour unions, interest in socialist economics as an academic subject, having read a book that was now considered suspect, became potential liabilities. Neighbours watched neighbours. Teachers were investigated by school boards. Librarians were asked, in some communities, to remove books from shelves. The machinery of suspicion did not require McCarthy to operate. It had installed itself in the daily social life of the country and ran without him. McCarthy's eventual undoing was, in an irony, perfectly suited to the decade television. During the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, broadcast live, millions of Americans watched him operate in real time and found the experience clarifying. The senator who had seemed powerful in print looked different on screen, bullying, reckless, unable to stop. When attorney Joseph Welch turned to him and said in a voice of real exhaustion, Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? The audience in the room fell silent. The country watching at home fell silent. McCarthy was censured by the Senate that same year and dead of alcohol-related illness by 1957 at 48 years old. But McCarthyism outlasted McCarthy. The habit of suspicion, the architecture of loyalty tests, the understanding that dissent carried costs, these did not evaporate with the man. They settled into the culture like sediment and took considerably longer to shift. The neighbour you should probably avoid was not a communist. He was just someone who had stopped being careful, and that, in the early 1950s, was enough. Getting dressed in 1950s, America is less a personal act than a social contract. There are rules, and while most of them are unwritten, they are enforced with the efficiency of a neighbourhood watch programme staffed entirely by people who have nothing else to do. Men wear suits, not just to work, to church, to the grocery store, sometimes to mow the lawn if they're feeling particularly committed to the aesthetic. Women wear dresses or skirts with a precision hemline, heels that are acceptable but not too high, and gloves when the occasion demands, which is more occasions than you would currently consider reasonable. The logic underpinning all of this was that your appearance was not your private business. It was a communication. What you wore told your neighbours what kind of person you were, what kind of family you came from, how seriously you took the project of being a respectable American. Deviation from the standard was not merely a style choice. It was a signal, and in the 1950s signals were read closely. A man in a t-shirt on his own front porch on a Saturday afternoon was fine. A man in a t-shirt at the grocery store was making a statement, and the statement was not flattering. For women, the standards were both more detailed and more consequential. Christian Dior's new look, which arrived from Paris in 1947 and reached American department stores by 1950, established a silhouette that organised everything. A nipped waist, a full skirt falling to the mid-calf, a structured bodice that required, and this is not a casual observation, foundation garments of genuine engineering complexity. The girdle was not optional, neither was the brassiere. Pantyhose had not yet been invented, which meant stockings, held up by a garter belt, which meant that getting dressed in the morning involved a sequence of steps that would seem, to a modern observer, to have been designed specifically to make you late. Hair was equally regulated. The ideal was set, styled, and lacquered into a shape that resisted atmospheric interference. Hairspray, which became widely available in aerosol form in the early 1950s, gave women the ability to maintain a hairdo across conditions that would previously have destroyed it: rain, wind, a vigorous disagreement with a neighbour. And this was marketed as liberation. The hairspray held everything in place. Everything was in place. That was the goal. For teenagers, the rules were contested in ways that horrified their parents and delighted the clothing industry. Blue jeans, which were workwear, had migrated to the high school hallways by the mid-50s, carried there largely by the gravitational pull of James Dean, who wore them in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955 and made self-destruction look excellent. Poodle skirts and saddle shoes went one direction, leather jackets and rolled-up jeans went another. The tension between these two aesthetics was, essentially, the decade's internal argument about what freedom meant and who got to have it. By the end of the decade, cracks had appeared in the dress code as surely as they had appeared in everything else. Beat poets in New York were wearing black turtlenecks and not apologising. Elvis was performing in clothes that moved. The rigid formality of the early 50s was beginning, slowly, to seem not like dignity but like constraint. In 1960, a young man ran for president in a suit that fit him like it had been made for a human body, and something shifted in how Americans thought about what formality was for. But in the heart of the decade, the rules held. You put on what the occasion demanded. You looked like what you were supposed to be. And if the girdle was uncomfortable, well, discomfort was not the sort of thing you mentioned. As the sun goes down and your parents settle in front of the television with their decaf, A different America comes alive in the parking lots on the edges of town. The drive-in movie theatre, of which there are now over 4,000 across the country, is technically a place to watch films. It is also, depending on your age and intentions, a food delivery location, a social hub, a first date venue, and a geography of negotiated privacy that teenagers have mapped with the precision of military strategists. You drive in, you hang the speaker on your window, you watch the cartoon hot dog dance across the screen telling you to visit the snack bar, and then, once the feature begins, the real negotiations begin. Drive-in theatres had existed since the 1930s, but the post-war car culture transformed them from curiosity to institution. America in the 50s had more cars, more teenagers with access to those cars, and more distance between home and everything else. A combination that made the drive-in a natural consequence. At peak saturation in the late 50s, there were more than 4,000 drive-ins operating across the country, many of them running double features on summer nights, the projector beam cutting through the warm dark while hundreds of cars sat in their rows, each one a small private room with a windshield instead of a wall. The experience was engineered for discomfort in ways that were mostly overlooked, because the available alternative was staying home. The metal speaker hung crookedly on your window and emitted sound at a quality suggesting the original audio had been recorded inside a coffee can and transmitted through a garden hose. The image on the screen was visible from the front rows and optimistic from the back. The snack bar sold popcorn in containers so large they required both hands and a plan. None of this mattered, because the point was never the movie. The movie was the permission structure that got you there. For teenagers in the 1950s, whose lives were otherwise surveilled to an extraordinary degree by parents, by neighbours, by school administrators, by the ambient machinery of conformity that structured every other hour of their day, the drive-in offered something rare and specific, time and space in which they were, within certain limits, unobserved. What happened inside those cars varied considerably, and is best left as an exercise for the imagination. But it is worth noting that the era's widespread parental anxiety about drive-ins was not entirely unfounded, even if it was expressed in terms that confuse cause and effect. The films themselves occupied a separate category of American cinema, cheaper, faster and stranger than anything showing at the Downtown Picture Palace. Science fiction and horror dominated, creatures from lagoons, teenagers from outer space, insects exposed to radiation, and reconsidering their commitment to being small. The horror film was, for the 1950s, a useful container for anxieties that couldn't be expressed directly. A giant mutant ant was not a metaphor you needed to pass to feel its weight. You sat in your car in the warm dark, the speaker crackling, and something enormous moved on the screen, and you were, for the duration, genuinely scared in a way that was actually quite relaxing compared to being scared about the other things. By the early 60s, the drive-in had begun its long decline, outcompeted by television and later by the multiplex. But in its decade it was irreplaceable, a space between childhood and adulthood, between home and the world, between what you were supposed to be and what you were actually interested in becoming. Every town had one. Every teenager knew its geography. And on a summer Friday night, with the speaker hanging from the window and something large and improbable on the screen, it was, for a few hours, exactly enough. Let's step into the kitchen of 1955, and you will find something remarkable. A woman standing in front of a counter covered in products that did not exist 15 years ago, each one promising to save time, improve nutrition, and advance the general project of modern living. Processed food in the post-war era was not merely a convenience, it was an ideology. The war had accelerated food technology enormously, and the factories that had been producing rations for soldiers were now producing rations for housewives, dressed up in cheerful packaging and endorsed by women in advertisements who appeared to be genuinely thrilled to be opening a can. The can opener, in this context, was not a tool. It was a wand. The logic was straightforward and seductive. Science had improved on nature in essentially every other area, so why not food? Penicillin had arrived. The polio vaccine was coming. The atom had been split. Surely a shelf-stable cream of mushroom soup that required no refrigeration and could be reconstituted with half a can of water was simply the culinary equivalent of these achievements. The packaging said so. The advertisements said so. Women's magazines ran features with titles like "The New Science of Feeding Your Family" that treated opening a can of condensed soup as an act of forward-thinking domesticity. Nobody was asking the obvious follow-up question, which was whether the science of food had perhaps overshot the target somewhere around the invention of aerosol cheese. What the food industry had discovered, and was now deploying with considerable energy, was that convenience was not just a feature. It was an emotion. Products were not sold as shortcuts. They were sold as freedom. Freedom from the tedious, repetitive labour of scratch cooking. Freedom to spend your afternoon doing something more modern than peeling potatoes. The housewife who used a cake mix was not taking the easy route. She was being smart, she was being efficient. She was, in the vocabulary of the era, modern. Scratch cooking was what your grandmother did in a farmhouse before refrigeration and electricity, and the blessings of industrial food production. You lived in the 1950s, you had options. The cake mix is a useful case study in how this dynamic actually operated. When Betty Crocker and Pillsbury introduced their first cake mixes in the late 1940s and early 50s, the instructions required the user to add only water. Sales were disappointing. Market researchers and the food industry was conducting a remarkable amount of consumer psychology in this era, eventually concluded that the mixes were too easy. They made women feel they hadn't actually baked anything. The solution was to remove the powdered egg from the formula and require the consumer to add a fresh egg themselves. Sales improved substantially. One egg's worth of participation was enough to restore the sense of authorship. The product was otherwise identical. The egg was psychological. Processed food also reshaped the architecture of the meal itself. Casseroles built around canned cream soups became a category of their own. Frozen pot pies, introduced in the early 50s, offered a complete dinner in a disposable tin. Velveeta, which had technically existed since the 20s but achieved its true cultural moment in the post-war era, was marketed not as a processed cheese product, but as a superior cheese product, smoother, more consistent, less likely to do whatever unpredictable things real cheese did when it got warm. That it contained a list of ingredients cheese was not supposed to contain was not, in the 1950s, considered relevant information. By the end of the decade, the American grocery store had become a different kind of place than it had been 20 years earlier, larger, brighter, more abundant, and stocked with an increasing proportion of things that had been significantly altered between field and shelf. The food was cheaper, more available, and more uniform than anything previous generations had experienced. It was also, in ways that would take decades to fully understand, not entirely what it appeared to be, but it was modern. And in 1955 that counted for an enormous amount. Before you've fully woken up, before the coffee is brewed and the children have begun arguing, something quietly magnificent has already happened. Glass bottles of milk have appeared on your doorstep, placed there by a man in a white uniform who has been travelling the neighbourhood since 4 a.m. The milkman is a fixture of 1950s daily life, so thoroughly embedded in the routine that his arrival is not remarkable. It is simply part of the texture of morning, as expected as the newspaper landing on the porch and the church bells from 2 streets over. The milk delivery system was, by modern standards, an extraordinary piece of logistics. A single milkman might service 200 or more households on a daily route, arriving before sunrise, moving quietly along the street with a wire carrier loaded with glass bottles, exchanging the full ones for the empty ones left out the previous evening, all without waking anyone who wasn't already up. The empties were returned to the dairy, washed, refilled, and dispatched again. The whole system operated on a circular economy that was not described as an environmental virtue because nobody had invented that vocabulary yet, but which was one regardless. The milk itself was delivered in glass bottles with a distinctive feature. The cream, which was heavier, rose to the top and formed a separate layer visible through the glass. In cold weather it sometimes froze and pushed the cardboard cap several inches above the bottle's neck, a phenomenon that children found fascinating, and that meant you needed to bring the bottles in quickly before the neighbourhood birds discovered it, which they absolutely would. Mixing the cream back in was a morning task, performed by shaking the bottle in a gesture that looked, from the street, mildly alarming. Beyond milk, the delivery economy of the 1950s extended further than most people now remember. Bread was delivered. Eggs were delivered. In some communities, dry cleaning, laundry, and even ice were delivered by men on regular routes, who knew their customers by name, knew which families had expanded and needed an extra quart, knew which households had the dog that would wake everyone if you let the gate clang. The delivery relationship was a form of neighbourhood infrastructure, social and commercial at once, a network of small daily transactions that kept people in casual contact with one another in a way the car and the supermarket would gradually replace. The broader rhythm of the 1950s domestic day was organised around rituals that have since either disappeared or been compressed into invisibility. The morning newspaper arrived before breakfast and was read at the table by the husband before he left for work. Read meaning actually read. The full paper. Not skimmed in 3 minutes between notifications. The mail arrived once, sometimes twice, and its arrival was an event. Bills, letters, catalogues, the occasional parcel. Each one was a discreet communication that had travelled somewhere to reach you and deserved a moment of attention. Evening had its own sequence. The husband's return at a predictable hour, dinner at a set time, the children's bedtime enforced with consistency, the husband's after-dinner rituals of newspaper, television, and whatever hobby the garage contained. The sameness was not accidental. It was the structure. In a decade shaped by anxiety about what was happening in the world beyond the lawn, the bomb, the communists, the creeping sense that the post-war order was not as stable as advertised, the daily ritual was a small, manageable proof that things were still in order. The milk arrived. The paper arrived. The same things happened at the same times. Whatever was going on in Korea or Washington, the cream was still rising to the top of the bottle, and that was, for the moment, enough. You're not feeling well, so you make an appointment, and when you arrive, the doctor's office smells of something warm and familiar. Cigarette smoke, because your doctor is currently smoking. This is not concerning. In fact, this is, throughout much of the early 1950s, essentially an endorsement. Cigarette advertising in the decade frequently features physicians. Camel Cigarettes runs a campaign noting that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, a claim based on a survey that the company itself commissioned and conducted with the scientific rigour of a man asking his friends what they thought of his haircut. The advertisement ran anyway. Nobody audited the methodology. 44% of American adults smoked in 1954, and the number was climbing. Cigarettes in the 1950s occupied a cultural position that requires genuine effort to reconstruct from the present day. They were not a guilty pleasure. They were not a known hazard being willfully ignored. They were, in the mainstream understanding of the era, a normal and largely benign feature of adult life, a social facilitator, a stress reliever, a marker of sophistication. Humphrey Bogart smoked. Lauren Bacall smoked. Your doctor smoked. The president smoked. Cigarettes were handed out at hospitals. Doctors in some advertisements actively recommended specific brands to patients with throat irritation, suggesting that the smooth, mild qualities of their preferred cigarette would be less aggravating than the competition. This was the medical advice. You paid for this. The science suggesting that cigarettes cause lung cancer was not entirely absent in the early 1950s. A landmark study by Dolan Hill in Britain in 1950 had drawn a clear statistical link, and American researchers Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham had published similar findings. The problem was not that the evidence didn't exist. The problem was that the tobacco industry had developed, with impressive speed and coordination, a strategy for managing evidence it didn't like. In 1954, the major tobacco companies released what became known as the Frank Statement, a full-page advertisement placed in hundreds of newspapers across the country, acknowledging public concern about the health question and pledging to fund independent research. The pledge sounded like responsibility. It was designed to introduce doubt. If the science was contested, if there was still a question, then there was no reason to stop smoking while the question was being resolved. The resolution, conveniently, kept not quite arriving. Meanwhile, in the actual doctor's office, medicine in the 1950s had genuine achievements to its name, and some practices that have not survived scrutiny. The decade saw the introduction of the Salk polio vaccine, the beginning of open-heart surgery, the development of antipsychotic medications that would transform psychiatric care. Penicillin and the sulfur drugs had already changed the calculus of infection in ways that would have seemed miraculous to a physician from 20 years earlier. The era's doctors were not incompetent. They were operating within a framework of knowledge that was advancing rapidly in some directions and standing completely still in others. The standing still areas are instructive. Women's health was managed with a paternalism so thorough it barely recognised itself as such. Symptoms that would now prompt investigation were frequently attributed to nerves, anxiety, or the general constitutional delicacy of the female patient. Tranquilizers were prescribed with a generosity that reflected how much easier it was to medicate unhappiness than to ask what was causing it. Childbirth was managed with sedatives that left women conscious but dissociated, a practice called twilight sleep, which was believed to be kinder and which left many women with no memory of delivering their own children. The doctor finished his cigarette, made a note in your file, and told you to try to relax. You nodded. On the way home, you stopped and bought a pack of Camels, because the advertisement had been quite reassuring about the throat. It was 1953, and medicine was doing its best, which was sometimes genuinely extraordinary, and sometimes involved someone in a white coat smoking at you and calling it care. It is Saturday morning, and the family is going somewhere. The destination is almost irrelevant. What matters is the vehicle, which is a station wagon, and the station wagon matters because it is the physical expression of everything 1950s America believes about family, prosperity, mobility, and the open road. The car is enormous. It has fins, possibly. It gets a number of miles per gallon that would make a modern engineer close a laptop and sit quietly for a moment. It is a colour that exists only in the 1950s, something between turquoise and a mistake, and it is a source of genuine pride. The American automobile in the post-war decade was not primarily a transportation device. It was an object of desire, a measure of status, and an argument about what kind of person you were, all of which had to be updated annually, because the manufacturers released new models every year and made last year's look dated with the precision of people who understood exactly what they were doing. Planned obsolescence was not a secret. It was, in the words of General Motors design chief Harley Earl, the organised creation of dissatisfaction. Earl said this out loud at an industry conference, and it was not considered a confession. The station wagon occupied a specific niche within this theology. Sedans and coupes were for single men and aspirational young couples. The station wagon was for families, and not just any families, but the right kind, the growing kind, the suburban kind with a driveway long enough to park it in, and children who needed to be transported to baseball practice and vacation destinations and the new shopping centre on Route 9. The rear-facing third-row seat, which faced backward and was occupied exclusively by children who spent the journey making faces at the car behind them, was a design feature that suggested nobody had fully thought through what children would do back there. They made faces. They always made faces. This was not a surprise. Gasoline cost approximately 25 cents a gallon in the mid-50s, a price point that made fuel economy an irrelevant consideration and engine size a metric of personal expression. Cars grew. Tail fins, introduced by Harley Earl as a design element on the 1948 Cadillac, spread through the industry until by 1959 the Cadillac Eldorado had fins so large and structurally committed that they seemed to be making a separate argument from the car itself, an argument about optimism, about trajectory, about the general direction of America, which was forward and upward and away from whatever had come before. The fins had no aerodynamic function. Their function was emotional. They were the visual grammar of post-war confidence. Road trips were a defining ritual of the era, made possible by the new interstate highway system that Eisenhower pushed through Congress in 1956, partly for military logistics and mostly because a nation that had just spent a decade watching roads on newsreels from Europe and Asia had decided it wanted better ones. The family loaded into the station wagon, the luggage strapped to the roof rack because the back was full of children, and drove. Motels appeared along the highways in such numbers and with such cheerful, identical signage that navigating them required only the ability to spot a vacancy sign from a moving vehicle. The American road trip was the decade's secular pilgrimage, a proof that you had the car and the time and the freedom to go somewhere, even if somewhere turned out to be a motel pool in Missouri. The car also quietly restructured everything it touched. Towns built around the car sprawled in ways that towns built around walking or transit could not. Shopping moved from downtown to the strip mall on the highway. Churches built parking lots. Restaurants added drive-through windows. The infrastructure of daily life was redesigned around the assumption that everyone had a car and would use it for everything, an assumption that was mostly true for white suburban Americans and significantly less true for everyone else. The station wagon rolled down the new highway past the new shopping centre toward the new suburb, fins gleaming in the morning light, getting 11 miles to the gallon, carrying a family toward a Saturday that looked exactly like the previous one, which was the point. Tuesday evening, 7 o'clock, the elementary school gymnasium. The folding chairs are out, the coffee is burnt, and approximately 40 people who have very strong opinions are about to spend 90 minutes finding consensus about curtains. The Parent-Teacher Association meeting is one of the central civic institutions of 1950s suburban life, and what happens inside it bears very little resemblance to the agenda that was distributed beforehand. The official items, the school bake sale, the new reading curriculum, the question of whether the parking situation on Maple Street constitutes a hazard, are merely the framework. The real business is social surveillance, neighbour assessment, and the careful distribution of community approval and disapproval. The PTA was, by 1955, one of the largest volunteer organisations in the United States, with several million members. This is worth pausing on. Several million people, primarily women, voluntarily attending meetings in school gymnasiums on weekday evenings to discuss the operational details of institutions that employed professional staff to run them. The dedication was real, and the impact was genuine. PTAs raised money, shaped curriculum debates, and served as a direct channel between parents and school administration. But they were also, in the social ecosystem of the suburb, something else. The primary arena in which women who had no professional title and no public role demonstrated their competence, their taste, their organisational capability, and their right to be taken seriously. Because the suburb offered few other venues for this. Your neighbour across the street had a degree she wasn't using. The woman 2 doors down had run a department in a hospital during the war and was now organising the spring carnival. The woman at the end of the block had opinions about municipal zoning that would have made her an effective planning commissioner and were being applied instead to the question of whether the school gymnasium needed new bleachers. The intelligence and energy that other decades would root into careers was, in the 1950s, routed into the PTA, and the PTA was shaped accordingly, more intense, more political, more consequential than an outside observer might expect. The social dynamics were intricate. Showing up was mandatory in the soft sense. You were not required to attend, but not attending was noticed. And being noticed not attending required an explanation that had to be good enough to be repeated accurately by 3 different people and still sound acceptable. Bringing the right thing to the bake sale mattered. Volunteering for the right committees mattered. Disagreeing with the wrong person in front of witnesses required careful management of the recovery. None of this was written down. It didn't need to be. Information moved through the PTA network with impressive velocity. A remark made at Tuesday's meeting could, by Thursday, have reached a household 2 streets away in a form that had acquired additional context, texture, and implications that may or may not have been present in the original. The gossip network of the 1950s suburb is sometimes described as a side effect of proximity and boredom, but that undersells its function. It was information infrastructure. In a community where knowing your neighbour's business was both a social norm and a form of collective self-regulation, the PTA meeting was where the raw material was gathered, sorted, and redistributed. By the end of the decade, the PTA had become a minor political battleground as well, infiltrated by the decade's broader anxieties about communist influence in education. There were genuine organised efforts to investigate school curricula for subversive content, driven partly by McCarthyism's cultural aftershocks and partly by parents who had been reading pamphlets and were now concerned about the library. The librarian, in some communities, was having a harder Tuesday evening than usual. She had also brought excellent brownies, which helped somewhat. There is a man on your street. There is always a man on your street whose lawn is perfect. It is the green of something that does not occur in nature, striped in alternating directions with a precision suggesting geometry homework, edged along the sidewalk with what must be surgical instruments. He's out there every Saturday. He's watching your lawn when you cannot see him. In 1950s suburban America, the lawn is not grass, it is character. The condition of your yard is a public statement about your values, your work ethic, your respect for the neighbourhood, and the structural soundness of your marriage. The American lawn as a cultural institution predates the 1950s, but the decade brought it to its fullest, most consequential expression. The suburban development model, identical houses on identical plots, with identical front yards visible from the street, created the conditions for lawn comparison in the same way a standardized test creates the conditions for grading. When every yard is the same size and shape, the variables that remain are entirely about effort and judgment. Your lawn, therefore, was not your lawn. It was your score. The tools of lawn maintenance multiplied accordingly. The push mower gave way to the power mower, which was marketed with the same technological optimism as every other appliance of the era, an advertisement suggesting that a man with a power mower was not merely doing yard work but participating in progress, mastering nature with machinery, conducting his small corner of the American century with appropriate efficiency. By the late 50s, riding mowers had appeared, which allowed a man to sit while covering the same ground his grandfather had stood to cover, a development that was described as convenient and experienced, as deeply satisfying. The grass itself was a matter of considerable deliberation. Kentucky bluegrass was the prestige option in the northern states, dense, fine-textured, the green that other greens aspired to be. Maintaining it required watering on a schedule, fertilizing in the fall, overseeding bare patches with a dedication that would seem, in a different context, like a psychological condition. Crabgrass was the enemy. Dandelions were a moral failing. The chemical industry, which had also benefited enormously from wartime production and was now looking for domestic applications, supplied herbicides and pesticides with names that sounded like authority and were applied to residential lawns in quantities that, in retrospect, warrant a careful look at where all of that went. Many suburban developments came with deed restrictions and homeowners association rules specifying lawn standards, the height to which grass could grow before it became a violation, the kinds of plantings permitted in the front yard, the materials from which fences could be made. These rules were enforced with varying degrees of formality, but their informal enforcement was considerably more reliable than anything written down. A lawn that went unmowed for 2 weekends generated comment. A third weekend generated a visit. By the fourth, the visit came with a casserole, which was both neighbourly and a communication. The man with the perfect lawn was, in the social semiotics of the decade, not simply a good gardener. He was a man who was in control of his property, which meant he was in control of his circumstances, which meant he was the right kind of neighbour in the right kind of community doing the right kind of things on Saturday morning. Whether this was true about him in any other dimension was not strictly the point. The lawn was the evidence, and the evidence was visible from the street, and in the 1950s suburb, what was visible from the street was what was real. Let's take a brief, quiet look inside a cabinet that the 1950s doesn't discuss very often, the one above the bathroom sink that holds a number of small orange bottles with typed labels. The post-war era sees a remarkable rise in the prescription of tranquilizers and sedatives to American women, a development that pharmaceutical companies are extremely enthusiastic about, and that physicians facilitate with a fluency, suggesting they have been waiting for exactly this product. Miltown, introduced in 1955, becomes one of the best-selling drugs in American history essentially overnight. It is prescribed for anxiety, for irritability, for what doctors of the era frequently describe as nervousness, a word applied to women with a frequency that should have been its own diagnosis. Miltown's success was not manufactured from nothing. There was genuine demand, and the demand pointed at something real. The 1950s housewife occupied a position of structural contradiction, educated enough in many cases to be aware of alternatives, and constrained enough by economics and social expectation and the architecture of suburban daily life to be unable to pursue them. The resulting tension had to go somewhere, and what the medical establishment offered it was a small white pill that turned the volume down on the tension without addressing its source. This was described in medical literature as treatment. It functioned, in practice, more like management. By the late 1950s, Miltown had been joined by Librium, introduced in 1960, and the class of drugs that would eventually be known as benzodiazepines was establishing itself as the pharmacological backbone of the decade's domestic ideal. The advertisements for these drugs, placed in medical journals and targeted at physicians, are documents worth examining. They frequently featured women, drawn or photographed in domestic interiors, kitchen or living room, appearing vaguely distressed and surrounded by the ordinary objects of household life. A sink full of dishes, a crying child, a window looking out onto a suburban street. The drug's effect was illustrated by the same woman, same setting, now calm. The dishes were still there. The child was still there. The window still looked out on the same street. Only her relationship to these things had changed, which was the product's value proposition stated with accidental clarity. The broader medicine cabinet contained other stories. Amphetamines, prescribed as diet pills under names like Dexedrine and Benzedrine, were widely used by women attempting to maintain the specific body shape the decade required. The 1950s silhouette was not naturally occurring. It required a nipped waist and a particular relationship with food that was difficult to sustain without either exceptional metabolism or pharmaceutical assistance. Diet pills were not on the fringe. They were in the medicine cabinets of ordinary suburban women, prescribed by ordinary suburban doctors, part of the ordinary maintenance of looking the way you were supposed to look. Sleep was another area managed by prescription. Barbiturates and sleeping pills circulated through the decade with the same casual availability as aspirin, used to manage the insomnia that tends to develop when your waking hours contain both excessive demand and insufficient meaning. The combination of stimulants to get through the day and sedatives to get through the night was not unusual. It was not discussed in polite company. It was simply there, in the cabinet above the sink, part of the infrastructure of an era that asked women to be several incompatible things at once, and supplied, with genuine if misguided helpfulness, a chemical means of tolerating the requirement. The medicine cabinet of the 1950s housewife was not a sign of individual weakness. It was a symptom of a structural problem for which the decade had not yet developed language, let alone solutions. Betty Friedan would name part of it in 1963. The pharmaceutical industry had been treating the symptom since 1955. Between the naming and the treating, several million small orange bottles accumulated in several million bathroom cabinets, and the dishes remained in the sink, and the window still looked out on the same street, and Tuesday came around again. On a Friday evening in 1955, a gymnasium at an American high school has been transformed. The bleachers are pushed back, a record player is plugged in, and teenagers in poodle skirts and rolled-up jeans begin doing something that their parents find deeply alarming: dancing. The music is rock and roll, a term that covers an enormous range of artists and styles, but which, in the minds of concerned American adults, means one thing: a primitive beat originating in Black American musical tradition, being adopted by white teenagers, and apparently loosening their moral framework at a rate that suggests the whole structure could give way by homecoming. The sock hop got its name from the practical requirement that students remove their shoes before dancing on the gymnasium floor, which the school administration wished to protect from scuff marks. This was the adults' primary concern going in. It was not the primary concern coming out. What happened when the record player was turned on and Chuck Berry started playing, and 200 teenagers who had been sitting in classrooms all day discovered that their bodies had opinions about rhythm? That was the concern. The floor survived. Other things were less certain. Rock and roll arrived at the cultural mainstream in the early to mid-50s through a convergence of forces that seem, in retrospect, entirely inevitable, and that were experienced at the time as a sudden emergency. Rhythm and blues, the Black American genre from which rock and roll drew its propulsive energy, its attitude, and a considerable percentage of its actual songs, had existed for decades, but had been contained, commercially and culturally, in what the music industry called race records, material marketed specifically to black audiences and largely invisible to white radio. What changed was teenagers, white teenagers, with new disposable income and an emerging sense of themselves as a distinct consumer category, found rhythm and blues and discovered that it made them feel something the music their parents preferred did not. Radio disc jockey Alan Freed began programming rhythm and blues for white audiences in Cleveland in 1951, calling it rock and roll, a term borrowed from the music itself, where it had meanings their parents would have found additionally alarming. The audience found it. When Freed moved to New York and threw the first large rock and roll concert, the Moondog Coronation Ball in Cleveland in 1952, demand so exceeded the venue's capacity that the event had to be shut down. 20,000 people showed up for a venue that held 10,000. This was treated as a problem. It was actually a diagnosis. Elvis Presley's appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, filmed from the waist up to prevent the broadcast of his hips, is the decade's most famous instance of the adult establishment trying to manage something that had already escaped management. The hips were the point. The physicality was the point. A music that began in the body rather than the head, that made you want to move before you had decided whether to move, that treated Saturday night as a reason rather than a reward. This was genuinely new to white middle-class America, and its newness was experienced as danger by people who had organized their entire social world around the suppression of precisely this kind of impulse. The sock hop, in this context, was a compromise, a supervised, school-sanctioned version of the thing that adults feared most, drained of the dark and the car and the drive-in, and reduced to a gymnasium with a record player and a teacher standing at the door. It was rock and roll with the shoes off. It was the decade's attempt to let teenagers have something while maintaining the conditions under which having it could be observed and, if necessary, stopped. The teenagers danced anyway. They always were going to dance. Here is the washing machine, gleaming white, purchased on installment, humming reassuringly in the basement or the kitchen nook or wherever it has been placed as evidence of modern progress. Before this, laundry was an all-day ordeal involving tubs and boards and physical effort that left women's hands raw by evening. The automatic washing machine promises liberation, and in terms of raw labour, it genuinely delivers. Laundry that once took a full day now takes an hour. This should, logically, give the 1950s housewife an extra 6 or 7 hours per week. What happens instead is that standards rise. Clothing that was washed once a week is now expected to be washed after a single wearing. Sheets that were laundered every 2 weeks are now changed twice that often. The economist Staffan Linder called this phenomenon the harried leisure class, the paradox in which labour-saving technology generates not more free time, but more demanding standards that consume the saved time and then some. He wrote the book in 1970. The housewives of 1955 were already living the research. The washing machine reduced the effort required to wash a shirt from 45 minutes to 15, and the cultural response was to develop an understanding that shirts required washing more frequently. The machine had not liberated time. It had merely allowed a higher frequency of cleanliness to become the baseline expectation, after which anything less than that baseline looked like failure. This dynamic played out across virtually every domestic appliance of the era. The vacuum cleaner, which had existed since the 1920s but became universal in the post-war decade, reduced the effort of cleaning floors significantly. It did not reduce the time spent cleaning floors, because the new standard was that floors should be cleaned more often. The automatic dishwasher, a luxury appliance whose ownership was itself a status marker, washed dishes faster than hand washing. It did not reduce the total labour of the kitchen, because the faster dishes could be cleaned, the more elaborate the meals it was appropriate to produce, which generated more dishes. The appliances were real. The liberation was largely theoretical. Women's magazines of the era were fully invested in the liberation narrative, partly because they were ideologically committed to it, and partly because their advertising was purchased by the companies selling the appliances. An advertisement for a washing machine in a 1952 issue of Better Homes and Gardens does not say this machine will raise your standards and generate new obligations at roughly the rate it eliminates old ones. It says now you'll have time for the things that really matter, accompanied by an image of a smiling woman in a clean kitchen doing something that is clearly not laundry. What the things that really matter turn out to be, in the magazines that run these advertisements, is more homemaking, better entertaining, more elaborate cooking, more attentive child rearing. The liberation was circular. Sociologist Ruth Schwartz Cowan documented this phenomenon exhaustively in her 1983 book More Work for Mother, tracing how each major domestic technology of the 20th century had increased rather than decreased the total labour burden of housework by raising standards, eliminating servants and communal labour arrangements, and making the housewife solely responsible for tasks that had previously been distributed. The research came decades after the decade, but the experience it described was entirely recognisable to anyone who had operated a 1950s household. The washing machine hummed in its corner. The laundry was done more often. The husband's shirts were whiter than his father's had ever been. Nobody talked about the hours this required because the machine was supposed to have eliminated the hours, and if it hadn't, that was a management problem rather than a design flaw, and the management was the woman standing in front of it, and she was, by all external indicators, fine. The machine was modern. The house was clean. Progress had occurred. The fact that she was more tired than her grandmother, who had done this by hand once a week and called it a day, was not a data point that fit the narrative, so it was filed elsewhere. Somewhere between the old farmhouse where your family used to stay with relatives, and the gleaming hotel that requires a reservation, and a tie in the lobby, a new American institution has emerged along every highway in the country. The motel, the motor hotel, the place where you pull your enormous turquoise station wagon directly in front of your door. Not a lobby, not a porter, just your door. And you bring your bags inside and it smells of cleaning product. And there is a swimming pool and a vending machine and a television, and you are free in a way that the American road is making newly possible. The motel was a product of the car and the highway in the same way the suburb was a product of the car and the mortgage. A new kind of place that could not have existed without its enabling technology, and that immediately developed its own culture, its own aesthetics, and its own mythology. The earliest motor courts of the 1930s were modest, a row of cabins with a shared bathroom and a gravel parking lot. By the mid-50s, the motel had upgraded itself considerably. Swimming pools appeared. Neon signs became elaborate, competitive, visible from a quarter-mile down the highway. The vacancy sign, glowing red or green, became one of the defining images of post-war American mobility, a small, clear promise that you could stop here, that here was available, that the road had an off-ramp. Kemmons Wilson opened the first Holiday Inn in Memphis, Tennessee in 1952, and the concept spread with the speed of something that was solving a problem people hadn't fully articulated. The problem was consistency. Roadside accommodations in the early 50s varied enormously. Some were clean and pleasant, some were not. And the only way to know which you were pulling into was to get out of the car and check, which required a level of optimism about what you might find. The chain motel offered uniformity. You knew what a Holiday Inn looked like. You knew what it cost. You knew the pool would be a certain size and the bed would be a certain hardness, and the television would get the local channels. This was not glamorous. It was, for a family who had been driving since 6 a.m. and whose children had stopped being interesting about 3 hours ago, exactly what was required. The road itself was being transformed by the interstate highway system, authorized by Congress in 1956 as the largest public works project in American history. Eisenhower had been impressed by the German Autobahn during the war and had returned with the conviction that modern military logistics required modern roads, a conviction that aligned neatly with the desires of automobile manufacturers, oil companies, tire companies, construction contractors, and everyone else who stood to benefit from a country rearranged around the car. The interstates bypassed towns that had previously been on the main route, creating ghost towns in some places and boom towns at interchanges in others. The roadside economy that developed at these interchanges, motels, diners, gas stations, eventually fast food chains, was an entire civilization built specifically for people in transit. For the American family in a station wagon in 1957, the open highway was a specific kind of freedom that it is worth taking seriously. It was freedom of movement at a scale and ease that no previous generation had experienced. You could get in the car and go somewhere that was not the place you had been. The country was large and the roads were new and the motels were lit up along the highway and the radio played something good and the children were briefly, mercifully, asleep in the back. The freedom was real, even if it required a car and gas and a credit card and a home to return to. The motel sign glowed in the dark. You turned in and pulled up to your door, and the night was warm and the day was done. That was enough. That was genuinely enough. You wake up at 7, you put on your suit, you eat the breakfast your wife has prepared, you drive to work, you sit at a desk that is arranged identically to all the other desks, you do not disagree with your supervisor, you do not stand out, and you come home. This is success in 1950s corporate America. The organization man, sociologist William H. White's 1956 name for the new corporate type is not an individual pursuing personal ambition. He is a component of a system, and the system rewards loyalty, conformity, and the ability to function within a clearly defined hierarchy without causing anyone discomfort. The great irony is that this was considered freedom. The post-war corporate landscape had reorganized itself around the large institution with a thoroughness that surprised even the people inside it. Companies like IBM, General Electric, and General Motors had grown during the war into entities of genuine enormity, and they had developed, in response to that growth, bureaucratic cultures that prize stability over innovation, process over personality, and the man who fits smoothly into the existing structure over the man who had ideas about improving it. Getting hired by one of these companies was not the beginning of a career. It was, in the understanding of the era, a permanent arrangement, a mutual commitment between employee and corporation that was expected to last until retirement and was understood by both parties to carry obligations beyond the purely contractual. The corporation in turn offered things that are difficult to reconstruct from a present in which employment is understood as inherently contingent. It offered security, not just a salary but a pension, a defined benefit that would pay you a monthly amount for the rest of your life after you retired at 65, a promise the company was legally and morally expected to keep. It offered health insurance at a time when health insurance was becoming increasingly important and was not yet understood as a political problem. It offered a social world, company picnics, bowling leagues, Christmas parties, at which everyone from the vice president to the mailroom appeared in the same gymnasium, and the hierarchy was briefly, artificially suspended. The company was not just an employer, it was a community, and leaving it voluntarily was understood, in some circles, as a form of ingratitude. What the corporation asked in return was total availability and the suppression of inconvenient individuality. You did not, in the 1950s corporate culture, express strong personal opinions at work unless they aligned with the opinions of the people above you. You did not dress differently from your colleagues. You did not arrive late or leave early or question the allocation of your time in ways that suggested you had a life the company had not already accounted for. Personality tests, which were administered by many large corporations as part of the hiring process, were designed partly to screen out the excessively individual. People who scored too high on measures of autonomy or unconventionality were considered poor organizational fits, which was true, and poor employees, which was a more complicated claim. The corporate wife existed in parallel to the corporate man as a recognized category with recognized obligations. Her husband's prospects at the company were understood to be affected by her social performance, her ability to entertain his colleagues' wives, to present a household that reflected well on the family and by extension on the company, to be the right kind of person at the right kind of gatherings. Some companies explicitly considered a wife's personality and social skills when evaluating a man for promotion. This was not secret. It was policy, occasionally written down, more often simply understood. By the end of the decade, cracks were appearing. The organization's demands were generating a literature of restlessness. Sloane Wilson's novel, The Man in the Grey Flannel Suit in 1955, White's book, A Year Later, a growing sense among the men inside the system that something had been exchanged for security that was worth more than security. The desk was the same as all the other desks. The suit was grey. The commute was the same length in both directions, and the pension was 30 years away, which was a long time to sit still. On a dusty stretch of road in San Bernardino, California, two brothers named Richard and Maurice MacDonald have done something in 1948 that will take most of the following decade to fully detonate. They have applied factory logic to hamburgers. The speedy service system reduces the number of menu items, assigns each worker a single repetitive task, and eliminates the car hops in favour of a walk-up window. It is efficient and impersonal, and the food is hot and cheap, and tastes exactly the same every time, which turns out to be something Americans want with an urgency that surprises even the McDonald's. The traditional American diner, which the fast food restaurant was in the process of displacing, was a different kind of institution entirely, slower, more personal, more embedded in the specific community it served. The diner had a counter with stools that swiveled, a row of booths with cracked vinyl that had been repaired with electrical tape, a coffee urn that ran all day, and a waitress who had been there long enough to know your order before you sat down. It was a social space as much as a food space, a place where the same people appeared at the same times, and were known to the person behind the counter in the way that requires years of daily proximity to achieve. The food was made by a person who had made it many times before and had opinions about how it should be done. What the McDonald brothers had invented was the opposite of this, and what is remarkable is how immediately and completely it found its market. The walk-up window required no waitress, no tipping, no social navigation. The limited menu required no deliberation. The price, 15 cents for a hamburger in 1950, at a time when a sit-down diner hamburger cost 30, required no hesitation. You pulled up, you ordered, you received a bag, you left. The transaction was over in under a minute, and the food was consistent in a way that the diners, which depended on the cook's mood and the freshness of the delivery, and the general character of the day, was not. Consistency, again, as a product. Consistency as the thing people were willing to pay for. Ray Kroc, a milkshake machine salesman who visited the San Bernardino location in 1954 and found it operating 8 of his machines simultaneously, understood immediately what he was looking at. He was not looking at a restaurant. He was looking at a system, a replicable, scalable, location-independent system that could be installed anywhere a highway went and a car could pull off, which was, increasingly, everywhere. He became the McDonnell Brothers franchise agent in 1954 and had opened 100 locations by 1959. The Golden Arches, designed to be visible from a moving vehicle at highway speed, were not architecture. They were a signal, like a motel vacancy sign, promising the specific thing that was waiting behind them. The other fast food chains arrived in the decade's slipstream. Burger King appeared in 1953. Kentucky Fried Chicken franchised in 1952. Dairy Queen had been operating since 1940, but expanded through the 50s with the speed of something whose moment had finally arrived. Each one was solving the same problem: a country that was increasingly in motion, eating in cars, stopping at highways, needing something fast and reliable and cheap and immediately consumable through a paper wrapper. The problem was real. The solution was extraordinary in its scalability and troubling in its implications, most of which would take decades to fully materialize. The diner did not disappear. It adapted, contracted, and survived in pockets, in cities, in old towns that the interstate had bypassed, in the imagination of a generation that would eventually develop nostalgia for the cracked vinyl and the coffee that never ran out. But its cultural centrality was over. The counter with the swivelling stools had been outflanked by a walk-up window and a system so efficient it could feed a nation of people in motion without requiring any of them to slow down enough to become regulars. The waitress who knew your order watched from the window. The coffee urn kept running. Outside, the cars pulled through and kept going. Between 1946 and 1964, approximately 76 million children are born in the United States. This is not accidental. This is policy, culture, ideology, and biology arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. The returning soldier is expected to build a family. The young wife is expected to provide one. Articles, films, advertisements, religious institutions, and the general ambient pressure of the decade align in a single harmonious message. Have children, have more children, have them now, raise them in the suburbs, and consider it a contribution to national security. The connection between reproduction and national purpose was not entirely metaphorical in the 1950s. The Cold War framing of American domestic life cast the family as the fundamental unit of the free world's defense, not militarily but ideologically, as the proof that capitalism and democracy produce something worth defending. The Soviet model, it was argued, disrupted the family, collectivized the child, and subordinated the domestic to the political. The American model elevated the family. The large family, the happy family, the family in the suburb with the station wagon and the new refrigerator, was the rebuttal to communism delivered in the most personal possible terms. Having children was, in a light that the decade found perfectly natural to apply, patriotic. The mechanics of this were reinforced from every direction simultaneously. The GI Bill made home ownership accessible to young veterans, and homes were designed with bedrooms, multiple bedrooms, more than a childless couple required, anticipating the family that was expected to occupy them. The tax code introduced dependency exemptions that rewarded families financially for each additional child. Magazines ran features on large families with a warmth and admiration reserved in other eras for athletic achievement. Television families had children in the plural. Advertisements showed households of 4, 5, 6. The specific number varied, but the baseline was always more than 2. The children themselves, born in such quantity and with such cultural investment, were a generation shaped by their own numerousness. The school system that received them in the early 50s was not built for them and expanded frantically. New schools, new teachers, new curricula, all of it deployed at a speed that quality cannot always survive. The baby boomers moved through institutions like a wave through a garden hose, distorting each one at the moment of passage and leaving it changed behind them. Elementary schools in 1953, high schools in the early 60s, colleges in the late 60s, which is where things got complicated. The experience of childhood in the 1950s was shaped by the fact that there were so many children doing it simultaneously. Neighbourhoods full of children, schools overflowing with children. The street is a social ecosystem organised entirely around children who had been sent outside after breakfast and were expected not to return until dinner, navigating their own hierarchy, inventing their own games, sustaining minor injuries without adult supervision, and without anyone particularly worrying about this. The 1950s childhood was the last era in which a child's daily life was primarily other children, before the car, the organised activity, the scheduled playdate, and eventually the screen reorganised childhood into something more managed and considerably less feral. The theology of the large family had a shadow side that the decade preferred not to examine directly. Women who did not want children, or did not want as many children as the culture expected, had very limited options and no socially acceptable language for their situation. Contraception was legally restricted in many states. Griswold v. Connecticut, the Supreme Court case that established the right to contraceptive use by married couples, was decided in 1965, meaning that throughout the 1950s the law in some states actively prevented married people from obtaining birth control. The family was a choice, in the sense that all constrained choices are choices. The constraint was simply not acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required a conversation the decade was not prepared to have. Before you send your child to the pool this summer, and every child in 1950s America goes to the pool, it is essentially mandatory for the formation of a normal childhood. There is something you need to think about, and you have been thinking about it since June. And the thinking has a texture somewhere between low-level dread and magical thinking. Polio arrives in summer. It arrives without warning. It arrives in children, mostly children, and it leaves some of them unable to walk, and some of them worse than that, and no one knows exactly how it spreads except that water is involved and crowds are involved and summer is involved, which means that summer itself has become a season with an asterisk. Poliomyelitis had been a presence in American life since the epidemic of 1916, but the post-war years brought it to a new intensity that seemed almost deliberately timed to contradict the era's optimism. 1952 was the worst year in American history for polio. Nearly 58,000 cases reported, over 3,000 deaths, more than 20,000 people left with some degree of paralysis. In a country that had just survived a world war, and was congratulating itself on the arrival of abundance and security. The image of children in iron lungs, the large cylindrical machines that breathed for those whose respiratory muscles had been paralysed, was a specific horror. The enemy was invisible, the mechanism was poorly understood, and it took children. Parents made decisions in the absence of reliable information and filled the gap with a mixture of precaution and ritual. Swimming pools were closed in some communities during outbreaks, not because anyone was certain this would help, but because water and summer and large numbers of children were the known elements of the equation, and removing one of them felt like doing something. Children were kept home from movie theatres, gatherings were cancelled. The ice cream truck, that innocent herald of summer, was regarded with suspicion in epidemic years. Mothers who let their children go to the pool and mothers who kept their children home were both making decisions in the dark, and both could turn out to have been right, and neither could know in advance. Jonas Salk had been working on a polio vaccine at the University of Pittsburgh since the late 1940s, using a killed virus approach that many of his colleagues considered theoretically inadequate. Salk disagreed with his colleagues with a stubbornness that the history of the vaccine has mostly retroactively coded as visionary. The field trial conducted in 1954 was the largest medical experiment in American history at that point. over 400,000 children received either the vaccine or a placebo in a double-blind trial whose results were announced on April 12, 1955, exactly 10 years after Franklin Roosevelt's death. The vaccine worked. The announcement was made at the University of Michigan and immediately broadcast across the country. Church bells rang in some cities. Schools dismissed early. People wept in streets and in workplaces and in kitchens where they had been standing over a radio trying to hear clearly. The reaction was out of proportion to an ordinary medical announcement, because it was not an ordinary medical announcement. It was proof that the thing that had been taking children for 40 years could be stopped, that the dread that had moved quietly through every summer like a shadow could be dissolved by a needle. Salk became the most celebrated scientist in American life almost instantly, a status he occupied with more discomfort than the public found entirely satisfying. He had declined to patent the vaccine, famously responding when asked who owned it by saying the people owned it. Could the sun be patented? Children lined up in school gymnasiums across the country, sleeves rolled up, and the iron lungs began, slowly, to empty. The pool reopened. Summer became, gradually, just summer again, warm and ordinary and full of children who would grow up not knowing, most of them, what their parents had been afraid of every June. Before the 1950s, there is no teenager. There are children, and then there are young adults, and the transition between them is relatively abrupt and primarily economic. You finished school, you went to work, you became an adult. The teenager, as a distinct consumer category with its own music, its own fashion, its own slang, and its own television programming, is a creation of post-war prosperity. For the first time, large numbers of American young people have time between childhood and adulthood, time to attend high school, time to socialize, time to form an identity, and crucially, they have money. The money is not incidental, it is foundational. Allowances expanded in the post-war era as family incomes rose, and teenagers, who had few of the expenses of adults and all of their purchasing desires, became a consumer demographic almost by accident. A 16-year-old in 1955 might earn several dollars a week from a part-time job or an allowance, with no rent, no groceries, and no utility bills to absorb it. That money went somewhere, and where it went determined the shape of the decade's youth culture, to record stores, to movie theatres, to clothing stores that were beginning to stock items designed specifically for people who were not quite children and did not want to dress like their parents. The music industry understood this first. Record labels targeting teenagers, Sun Records in Memphis, Chess Records in Chicago, Atlantic in New York, were not operating on the assumption that parents would approve of what they were selling. They were operating on the assumption that teenagers would buy it anyway, which proved correct. The 45 RPM single, introduced in 1949, was cheaper than an album and perfectly sized for a teenager's budget and attention span. One song, one purchase, 3 minutes of something that belonged entirely to you and not to your parents, who would not understand it and were not supposed to. The format and the music were designed for each other. The high school, in the 1950s, had become something it had not previously been. A total social environment that organised the daily lives of young people with the thoroughness of a small municipality. There were hierarchies, athletes, cheerleaders, the popular crowd, the drama kids, the ones who sat at the end of the lunch table, that were recognised and navigated with a seriousness that would seem disproportionate from the outside, and felt, from the inside, exactly proportionate. Social success in high school was the primary project of adolescent life, in a way that it had not been when most young people left school at 14 to work. When you spent 40 hours a week in an institution, and its internal social structure was the most immediate reality of your existence, getting that social structure right was not trivial, it was everything. The teenager also became, almost immediately, a source of adult anxiety that was somewhat in excess of the actual evidence. Juvenile delinquency, the 1950s term for teenage misbehaviour, which covered everything from vandalism to the wearing of leather jackets, to the general aesthetic of not caring what adults thought, was the subject of congressional hearings, sociological studies, and a considerable quantity of alarmed journalism. A 1955 Senate subcommittee investigated the effects of comic books on juvenile delinquency and concluded in a report that reads today as a document from another civilization that the comic book industry required regulation. This, too, was treated as a crisis. What the adult world was struggling to process was the teenager's fundamental novelty, a person who was, for the first time in history, allowed to exist in a sustained in-between state, not a child, not yet fully an adult, with money and time and a peer group and opinions, forming an identity that was not simply an inheritance from the generation above. That this might produce a distinct culture was, once you thought about it, entirely predictable. Nobody had fully thought about it. The teenager arrived anyway, bought a 45 and turned it up. On a Saturday afternoon in the suburbs, smoke rises from approximately every third yard, and a remarkable social ritual is underway. The backyard barbecue, in which a man who does not cook stands in front of a large metal apparatus that costs more than a bedroom set and prepares meat in a manner that requires no particular skill, but which is discussed with the intensity of a surgical consultation. The barbecue grill is central to 1950s masculine leisure identity in a way that seems, in retrospect, to have been assembled by a committee. The man cooks outside, the woman cooks inside. The outside cooking is the special cooking. The logic, such as it was, ran something like this. Cooking on an open flame is primitive and therefore masculine, whereas cooking on a stove involves appliances and planning, and is therefore domestic and therefore feminine. And never mind that both processes involve the application of heat to food in a controlled environment. The grill was coded masculine by virtue of its outdoor location, its connection to fire, and the speed with which it destroyed evidence of its inadequacy. A steak cooked badly on a grill produces charcoal, which is not subject to the same critical evaluation as a steak cooked badly in a pan. The grill was forgiving in a way that kitchens were not. The equipment reflected the era's commitment to appliance status. The Weber kettle grill, introduced in 1952 by George Stephen of Chicago, was a hemispherical design that controlled airflow and temperature with considerably more precision than the flat open braziers it was replacing. It cost more. It looked more serious. By the mid-50s, the backyard grill had become a category of consumer goods with its own upgrade path, from the entry-level flat grill to the kettle, to the larger kettle to the gas grill, which arrived later in the decade and allowed the griller to achieve the temperature precision of a stove while standing outdoors and maintaining the aesthetic of a man who was doing something fundamentally different from standing over a stove. The social function of the backyard barbecue was as important as its culinary function, which is fortunate because the culinary function was frequently underwhelming. The barbecue was a reason for neighbours to gather in a context that was informal enough to feel relaxed and structured, enough to have a clear host and a defined duration, criteria the suburbs' other social occasions did not always meet. You came over at 4, you had a beer from the cooler, you stood near the grill and discussed what was happening with the meat, you ate at 6, you went home at 8. The barbecue had excellent pacing. It solved the social problem of the suburb, which was that neighbours were in close proximity without quite knowing how to make use of each other in the hours between the end of the workday and the resumption of the next one. The food itself occupied a narrow repertoire: hamburgers, hot dogs, the occasional steak for guests who merited the expense, corn on the cob wrapped in foil and placed at the edge of the grill by the wife, who was doing this while also preparing the potato salad and the coleslaw and the dessert inside. The man monitored the meat. The distribution of labour was not discussed because it was not considered a distribution of labour. It was considered a Saturday afternoon. What the backyard barbecue celebrated, underneath its smoke and its paper plates, was the specific freedom of owning a backyard. the space, however modest, that was yours and that separated you from the apartment, the tenement, the cramped urban existence that the suburb had been built to escape. Standing at your grill on your grass behind your fence on a Saturday afternoon in 1957, with the neighbours on either side doing approximately the same thing. The smell of charcoal drifting across the subdivision in the warm late afternoon air, that was the dream made literal. You had made it. This was the evidence. The steak was slightly overcooked, but everything else was exactly right. Let's step outside. Because in the 1950s, the outside is where children are. Not supervised children, not scheduled children. Not children accompanied by a responsible adult with a water bottle and a safety briefing. Just children, sent into the neighbourhood after breakfast with no particular instructions except to come home when the streetlights came on. This is the organising principle of 1950s childhood. The street is yours. The neighbourhood is your territory, and the hours between breakfast and dinner are unstructured time to be filled according to whatever hierarchy of interest and social negotiation your particular cohort of children has developed. The conditions that produced this were specific to the era and have not fully recurred since. The suburban neighbourhood was, in the early to mid-50s, genuinely full of children, products of the baby boom who were the same age, and lived within walking distance of each other in densities that no previous generation of middle-class children had experienced. A single street might contain 15 or 20 children between the ages of 5 and 12, which is enough for most games and more than enough for most arguments. The critical mass was self-sustaining. There was always someone outside. There was always something happening. The games were largely self-invented, or inherited from older children who had inherited them from older children before that, in a transmission system that operated without adult involvement and therefore without documentation, which means that the rules of any given game varied by neighbourhood and sometimes by week. Kick the can, Red Rover, capture the flag conducted across 3 consecutive yards with disputed boundary conditions, elaborate bicycle journeys to places the children had been told not to go, which were almost always entirely mundane and slightly disappointing. The thrill was the going, not the arriving. The point was the unsupervised distance between home and wherever you were, the fact of being somewhere outside the parents' immediate sight line, which was the closest thing to freedom a 9-year-old could access on a Tuesday afternoon. Minor injuries were a feature rather than a defect of this arrangement. Knees met concrete regularly and were addressed with mercurochrome, a bright orange antiseptic that stained the skin for days and announced to the neighbourhood that you had participated in something. Broken arms occurred and were handled, bee stings, splinters, bicycle collisions. The ordinary casualty rate of unsupervised childhood in the 1950s was accepted as background noise rather than evidence of a systemic failure. Parents had a different relationship with childhood risk than would develop in later decades, one that recognised injury as a normal part of the learning process and reserved genuine alarm for the genuinely alarming. The physical world of the neighbourhood was known in extraordinary detail by the children who occupied it. Every shortcut, every yard with the dog, every house where the old man yelled, every empty lot with the interesting possibilities of its undergrowth. This geography was mapped and memorised and passed on. The vacant lot was a different kind of landscape than the managed park, less safe, more interesting, full of things that had been left there by forces nobody had explained. Building things in it, destroying things in it, sitting in it doing nothing in particular in the heavy summer afternoon. These were real activities, with real stakes, governed by a child's understanding of consequence that is, in retrospect, more sophisticated than it appeared. What was being formed in these hours, outside and unsupervised and bumping against each other and the world, with the full force of juvenile experimentation, was not simply character in the abstract. It was specific capacities, the ability to manage social conflict without an adult intermediary, to assess risk with limited information, to occupy time independently, to be bored and survive it and eventually find something to do. These are not dramatic capabilities. They are also not easily taught by any method that doesn't involve letting children be somewhere without you. The streetlight came on at dusk. They came home. They did it again tomorrow. Let's talk about what you're wearing, because 1950s women's fashion is one of the more cheerfully aggressive aesthetic statements in American history. A silhouette so specific that it became immediately identifiable as a decade, a worldview, and a target demographic all at once. The new look, introduced by Christian Dior in 1947 and arriving in American department stores by 1951, established a silhouette that organized everything. A nipped waist, a full skirt falling to the mid-calf, a structured bodice that required, and this is not a casual observation, foundation garments of genuine engineering complexity. The poodle skirt, a circle skirt with an appliqué poodle, often connected by a rhinestone leash to the hem, is its democratized felt fabric American cousin. The new look was, in its original context, a statement about the end of wartime austerity. During the war, fabric rationing had mandated narrow skirts and minimal decoration. Dior's response in 1947 was maximalism as ideology. So much fabric in that skirt, so much structure in that bodice, so many petticoats required to achieve the proper silhouette that the garment itself was an argument. Scarcity is over, femininity is back. The body is no longer a practical object but an aesthetic one. In France, this was controversial enough that women threw tomatoes at models wearing the new look on the street. In America, where the war had been less materially devastating, and where department stores had strong commercial reasons to embrace a fashion that required an entirely new wardrobe, it landed with considerably less resistance. The undergarments required to achieve the new look silhouette were a category of their own. The girdle was not optional. It was so thoroughly expected that its absence was remarked upon, which required a social infrastructure willing to monitor and comment on other women's foundation garments, which in the 1950s existed absolutely. The girdle compressed, smoothed, and produced the smooth hip line the silhouette required. It was constructed from a combination of elastic cotton and a level of structural ambition that, worn all day, produced by evening a specific exhaustion, located somewhere between the ribcage and the hip that women of the era recognized immediately and nobody discussed publicly. The brassiere was similarly engineered. The conical, structured style of the early 50s, producing a shape that bore a relationship to actual anatomy roughly comparable to the relationship between a traffic cone and a hill. Teenage girls modified the template. The poodle skirt, which any competent seamstress could make from a circle of felt and an iron-on poodle appliqué, was cheaper than a tailored dress and allowed more movement, specifically the kind of movement required at sock hop, which the structured new-look silhouette did not really accommodate. Paired with a tucked blouse, a cinch belt, bobby socks and saddle shoes, the poodle skirt outfit was both feminine in the era's approved sense and practical enough to survive a Friday evening of vigorous dancing. It split the difference between conformity and fun, which is exactly what teenagers have been doing to fashion in every decade since, and which adults have been describing as alarming in exactly the same terms each time. By the late 50s, the silhouette was shifting. Yves Saint Laurent, who took over at Dior following the designer's death in 1957, introduced the trapeze line, a looser, less structured shape that suggested the body beneath rather than sculpting it from the outside. Chanel suits, with their comfortable, unconstructed elegance, were gaining ground against the armour of the full new look. The girdle's days were numbered, though it did not know this yet and continued to be purchased and worn through the early years of the following decade with the grim persistence of something that hasn't gotten the message. The poodle skirt is now costume. It appears at Halloween and at 50s-themed dances and in the wardrobe department's shorthand for an entire decade. It deserves some of this. It was genuinely iconic, genuinely of its moment, a circle of bright felt with a small dog on it that somehow captured something true about a decade that was, under all its structure and nipping and tucking, trying very hard to have fun within approved parameters. The poodle skirt was the approved parameters, cheerfully worn. The rhinestone leash gleamed at the hem. The record player was on. The gymnasium floor was clear, and for 3 minutes in 1956, everything was exactly as advertised. As the 1950s give way to the 1960s, something changes. Or more accurately, something becomes impossible to ignore that was always there. The decade of the happy housewife, the gleaming suburb, and the confident American century begins to develop its own contradictions loudly enough that they can no longer be managed with a smile and a jello mould. Rosa Parks sits down in 1955. The Supreme Court rules on schools. A young senator from Massachusetts is talking about a new generation. The fallout shelter seems less like preparedness and more like an admission. The carefully maintained lawn, the perfectly pressed dress, the television telling you everything is fine. The stage set begins slowly to reveal that it is a stage set. The civil rights movement did not begin in the 1960s. It was present throughout the 50s, doing the patient, dangerous, unglamorous work of legal challenge and community organisation that the more visible confrontations of the following decade would depend on entirely. The NISP's legal strategy, which had been building toward Brown versus Board of Education for decades, succeeded in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that segregated public schools were unconstitutional. The ruling did not desegregate schools. It declared segregation unconstitutional, which is a different and more complicated thing, as the decade's subsequent years demonstrated, with federal troops deployed to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to enforce the enrollment of 9 black students at Central High School against the resistance of the state's governor, who had called out the National Guard to prevent them. This was happening in the same decade as the sock hops and the station wagons and the perfectly mowed lawns. The jello mould and the federal troops were not in different Americas. They were in the same one, and the ease with which the mainstream culture of the decade held them in separate compartments, the comfortable domestic life on one side, the systematic brutality of segregation on the other, and the two rarely allowed to be in the same frame, was not an accident. It was a choice made daily by the people producing the television programs and the women's magazines and the advertisements for refrigerators, and reflected daily by the people who consumed them. The consumer economy that had defined the decade's self-understanding was showing its own stress lines by the late 50s. The abundance was real, but it was unequally distributed in ways that the decade's official narrative found difficult to accommodate. Poverty existed in the suburbs' shadow, in the rural South, in Appalachia, in the urban neighbourhoods that white families had left behind, in the migrant labour camps that supplied the produce for the refrigerators. Michael Harrington's 1962 book, The Other America, would describe this invisible poverty with a clarity that shocked readers who had believed the decade's own account of itself. The shock was itself informative, that Americans could be genuinely surprised to learn that poverty persisted in the most prosperous nation in history, suggested how effective the 50s image management had been. The young senator from Massachusetts won the presidency in 1960 by the narrowest popular margin in the century. His campaign operated deliberately and shrewdly on the premise that something had gone slightly stale, that the comfort and security of the Eisenhower years had come at the cost of dynamism and purpose, that the country was not moving. Whether this was true was debatable. That it was persuasive to enough voters to matter was not. The decade ended not with a clear break, but with a gradual shift in the quality of light, the chrome still gleaming, the lawns still mowed, but something in the air suggesting that what had been built on this foundation was going to be tested, and that the foundation might be less solid than the advertisements had suggested. The grill was still smoking in the backyard. The children were still outside until the streetlights came on, but the questions that the decade had answered so confidently were being asked again, louder this time, and the answers were less certain than they had seemed in 1953, when everything was new, and the refrigerator matched the curtains, and the future was a straight line pointed at more. And so here you are, at the end of a single day in 1950s America, A day that began with cream rising to the top of a glass bottle on your doorstep and ended with the glow of a television set casting its particular grey light across a living room arranged specifically to receive it. You have eaten things suspended in gelatin. You have mowed a lawn for reasons that were never entirely about the grass. You have sat under a desk at school and covered the back of your neck with your hands and called it preparation. You have driven somewhere in a car the colour of a swimming pool, parked in front of a door that was specifically your door, and felt, briefly but genuinely, that this was what freedom looked like. It was a strange decade to live inside, confident on the surface in a way that required considerable maintenance, abundant in ways that were real and unequal in ways that were equally real and considerably less discussed. A decade that built fallout shelters in the backyard and called them prudence, that prescribed tranquilizers to unhappy women and called it medicine, that told its children to hide under their desks and called it safety. A decade that produced the most optimistic consumer culture in human history, while conducting the most anxious internal conversation about whether any of it would survive. And yet, the people who lived in it were not performing contentment into a void. The family around the television on a Tuesday evening was actually together. The neighbours arriving at the backyard barbecue actually knew each other's names, knew which family had the new baby, knew which house to knock on if the power went out. The children on the street until the streetlights came on were actually free, in the specific way that only comes from hours with no agenda and nowhere particular to be. The coffee at the diner was actually hot every time, poured by someone who had been pouring it long enough to make it feel like a small act of welcome. The 1950s was a decade that got a great deal wrong and knew how to make the getting wrong look like getting right, which is its own kind of skill. But the people inside it were stubborn and hopeful and funny, and sometimes kind in ways that didn't require an audience. And they built things, imperfect, unequal, often absurd things that they genuinely believed were going to last. Some of them did. Some of them deserved to. Some of them we are still very slowly renovating. So tonight, as you pull your blanket up and let the day go quiet around you, maybe spare a small, gentle thought for the woman who smiled at the refrigerator not because she was fooled, but because she was trying, and for the man on the street with the perfect lawn, who was doing the only thing the decade had told him to do with his particular kind of love, and for the children on their bicycles going somewhere they'd been told not to go, which turned out to be a vacant lot with nothing particularly interesting in it, which was fine, which was enough. History is rarely as simple as it looks from one end of it. And the 1950s, for all its chrome and conformity and aggressively optimistic gelatin, was full of people just trying to get through the day with something intact at the end of it. They mostly did sleep well.